So this is basically just going to be mostly about the observations. Please don't have any expectations that it's a rigorous scientific study like Josh's and Declan's studies. It was a field trial. And a bit of a disclaimer, I was kind of thrown into it at the last minute, and it was a bit of a rush job to get it up and running. So basically, why would you want this? And this is what the trial looked like in October last year. Why would you want this in your orchard? And when I'm referring to it, I will refer it to as a cover crop as well as a multi-species mix. So just so you get the terminology, if you're wondering what a cover crop is, I think the pollinator mix falls under the cover crop umbrella, if you like. So cover crops are known to increase insect diversity, and I think the previous speakers have reiterated that. Known to improve soil health, so add your organic matter, improve your microbial activity, and improve your soil structure over time. So we wouldn't have seen that in this one-year trial. They've also been known to improve your water use efficiency, and probably due to the microbial activity and the improved soil structure and water infiltration, etc. Nutrient recycling is an improved thing. Nutrient availability, so cover crops have deep tap roots, they'll bring stuff up from down below and make it more readily available to the plants. Less soil erosion through wind and water. They've also been widely used as biofumigants. In Queensland they use a lot, subcontinent they use a lot. And under recently released legislation, perhaps the potential to use these regenerative agriculture techniques to claim carbon credits. So there's a lot of benefits as to why you might want this messy looking site in your orchard. So the trial had 3 sites, as Wendy said. There were 3 growers involved. All sites had roughly 5-year-old trees, Hass avocados on reed or Zutano rootstock. Site 1 was in Northcliffe, had lighter, sandier soil types, some carry loam, sitting over clay, a layer of clay, and it had carry forest to the south and the west of the block. And that was a small block, about 200 trees. Jardee was a gravelly carry loam, so very well drained block, carry forest to the southwest, and a neighbouring orchard of avocados to the south and pasture paddocks to the north. That was a big block, 28 rows, about 1,280 trees. Dean Mill, site 3, and there wasn't any nepotism involved, but this was our orchard, so I'll just put it out there now so you know where Dean Mill was. Lovely block, carry loam, south-facing block, surrounded by orchard and pasture paddocks, no adjacent bush, about 500 trees in the block, and we had a lucerne base, so we sowed lucerne on in our interrows when the trees were about 1 year old. So just so you sort of know the background of what we're going into. So the trial basically, and I'm going to sort of show you, this is an aerial view of the place, of our place, but it basically is a really good pictorial idea of the design. So we used 2 interrow trial plantings, then 2 controls. So that was basically whichever the grower used as their normal orchard practice, and then repeat 3 times. So when we did the measurements, we were looking at the rows in the middle of the two planted rows, and so likewise if we're looking at controls, we were looking at the rows in the middle of the controls. And if you can just see down the bottom here, this was another row that we also took measurements on an adjacent block where we just left the plain lucerne, just to see if there was anything going on in that block that may not be happening in other blocks. It was last year in April at the height of COVID, so there was a lack of seed. It was a clamour to get seed, basically. I rang around a few merchandise people in Manji, and I think when I rang Shannon at Elders, the last 4 bags of seed had just walked out the door. So we were able to get, through Shannon, a custom mix from Bell's pasture seed. So Bell's up in Boyanup make a pollinator mix, It's normally a 12 species mix, but they ran out of 2 varieties, so they were able to make us a custom mix, and I'll tell you in the next few slides what we used. But just another little note on the design. One of the growers thought, so these are basically, we did a double run up and down the rows with the cedar where there was overlap in the middle. So one grower, the grower site 2 that had more rows, decided, well, let's have a look and see if I just do a single run up the middle of the row, half the costs, half the time, does that have any effect on pollination? So when you're selecting a seeding mix, and unfortunately we didn't have the luxury of time and choice in our case, but these are the things that you should be aware of if you're going to try this at home. So primarily go for nectar flowers, not pollen flowers. So avoid grasses and cereals because they only provide pollen. So you want the nectar flowers, and I think the previous speakers have reiterated that you want nectar, and that's going to feed your beneficial insect species and provide nectar so that they can survive for 90 days as opposed to 2 days, for instance. Consider your time to flowering. So whether it's 100 days, it's a late maturing variety, or whether it's a short maturing variety, and tweak your sowing time according to that. So don't go and plant anything that you don't want to be flowering too late, if that's what you want to do. Consider the rate to establish. So some of the pasture species in our mix were very quick to establish and very vigorous growers as seedlings, and then others were very poor germinators, didn't like a lot of competition and slow to establish and then get smothered out by the rest of the mix. Consider the number of seeds per kilo per hectare. So if you're planting things like a brassica, which has small poppy-like seeds, and clovers, which are very small seeds, you want to scale that amount back in your mix so that you're not planting so much of it and it's going to dominate. Mistake number 1 that we made, but it doesn't matter. That's why it's called a trial. But your larger seeded varieties like your peas and your vetch, you want to up those so that you get more plants per hectare rather include in your mix. Consider your soil type. So if you've got acidic soils, there's a lot of pastures that are suited to acidic soils. If you're over by the coast where you've got aluminium problems, there's a lot of pasture species that will tolerate aluminium. If you've got sandy soils, again, don't go and plant a heavy soil-liking legume. So those sorts of things. The age of your orchard, how much light is on the floor of your orchard, because there's no point trying this if you've got a 10-year-old tree that are just starting to touch over the rows and you're not going to get any light and you're not going to get any flowering underneath your trees. Consider whether it's an annual or a regenerating perennial species of pasture. So some will be very hard seeded and will continue to grow in your orchard in continuing years. Some will be perennial and just stay there. Some will produce new plants. So in terms of your costs going forward, you don't have to keep replanting, so you might want to select those. Inoculant is one that we didn't consider going in, and so you might want to consider that, because if you're using a big mix of legumes, that's probably going to be 5 or 6 different inoculants that you'll need to fix nitrogen if that's what you want your legumes to do. Your seeding equipment obviously is going to have a big effect on what you decide to use. And your seedbed preparation, if you've got mounds, you've got a V in the bottom of your middle interrows, that's going to be difficult to get a seeder up with a single run. And of course, probably the biggest factor that most people may encounter is the weed factor, the weed potential. So just consider what you do and don't want in your orchard, because you may rue the day that you ever planted a multi-species mix. So the mix we used, as I said, we were able to get a custom blend from Bell's. So it had basically 10 things in it. It was a 250 kilo custom mix. So the black mustard, it had black mustard, chicory, rye corn, field pea, common vetch, not the hairy vetch, Balanza clover, Persian clover, I'm not sure what type of medic, but there was a medic in there, and a pasture legume called Messina, which we didn't really see much of. And at site 3, we chucked a bit of buckwheat in just because some of the regen guys said try buckwheat. So we did. And as you can see there, and I've included the seed numbers, because we had 25 kilos of each, you can see that the smaller seeded species had far greater numbers per kilo and therefore per hectare than what the larger seeded species were. So your peas and your vetch and your rye corn were a lot lower. So as I said, we don't know, I don't know if it had inoculant on it. And other species you could also look at if you're looking, and I've also got an audit of pasture species that I prepared, so if anyone would like it, I can give it to Wendy and she can email it to you from New South Wales. But other things you could consider are linseed and safflower, the subclovers, because they're going to set seed every year, so you won't need to reseed those, and they're pretty good at being a subterranean seed setter that when you mow continually, you're not going to take your seeds away. Strawberry and Palestine clovers are probably good things to have in your mix. White clovers, as a few other people have touched on today, and that will grow in a bit more of a shady area as well. Ceradella, there's quite a few types of ceradella out these days, and lablab, which is a type of pasture legume which any cover crop, if you ever read about, has lablab in it. It's like the gold star of pasture cover crops. Plantain's a herb, and then you could look at other brassica types, a rape or a radish. So this is what we sowed into, just a quick snapshot so you can see how we prepared the seed beds. I'll tell you the ins and outs of what we did, but this is site 1 on the left, had a strong kike base, so he managed to knock most of that out. Site 2, you can see the sort of thatched kike, that was mowed as far down as we could before they sowed. And this is our place. As I said, we went into a legume pasture. This is actually taken in May, this photo, so it's 3 weeks after sowing, but before sowing was mowed right down to the ground as far as we could get it. So just the agronomic basics of what we did. We tried to get a double knockdown at each site, but the second site, it was too windy to do his second knockdown, so he ended up mowing it right down to the ground before he sowed. Most of us just used Basta and spiked the punch a little bit just to get a bit of a kick to get the kike to take it up. We all used different machines, so this one had tines and press wheels, this one had discs and press wheels and he rolled it afterwards, and this one used a little turf seeder and rolled afterwards. With the little turf seeder we couldn't get the pea and the vetch seeds to go through, so we broadcast them by hand. Luckily my son was home from school holidays, so that was his job. And then we rolled it afterwards to get the seeds in. And with this one, he sowed it shallow and then rolled it afterwards as well to allow the clovers to be near the surface to come up. All of us used 25 kilos a hectare. I probably wouldn't do that again. I'd probably scale it back to about 15. I think 25 was just a bit too much. I think site 1 put fertiliser underneath. This one didn't put any fertiliser on at all at sowing, and we broadcasted, it wasn't direct drilled, sorry. No pesticide applied to the sites 1 and 2. We had black beetle and snail problems, so we put Lawsban and slug out on just to give the seedlings the best chance to grow, seeing it was a trial anyway. No other post-fertiliser at site 1. Site 2 added a little bit of fertiliser to kick it along going into winter in the cold months, just so it didn't go reproductive too early. And this one had a bit of liquid later on as well. So the mustard established really, really well. In fact, too well. It was really dominant the whole time. From the day it came out of the ground to the end of the trial, the mustard was dominant. The clovers sat under the canopy quite happily until spring, when then they started to move. Clover at site 1 didn't germinate at all. We think it was probably the sowing depth, because at the end of the rows where the bar was lifted up to turn around, that's where the clovers were. So most likely seeding depth. Peas and vetch grew, but because of their low seed numbers per hectare, they weren't abundant, which was disappointing. I never saw the Messina, although Wendy reckons Sang saw it when she came out for a site visit. But it wasn't very dominant, so perhaps it wasn't very present, perhaps doesn't like competition. The buckwheat was too cold, didn't germinate. At all sites the kike grew back, more so at Northcliffe, but definitely the kike came back. And the pest problems, there wasn't a great deal of pest issues, probably just some snails and a few beetles, but probably if you had that situation every year for 3 to 5 years, I think you'd probably find you'll end up with a few snail problems. So it grew pretty well at most sites. This is 6 weeks, I think, after planting at site 3. And as you can see, the mustard there is quite dominant. There's a vetch plant present, and the little clovers just sitting there under the canopy, not doing a great deal, but they're there. This was a control row that we compared, not a lot in the control rows, kike and clover mostly. And then this is the growth in August, where you can see a few different things, but the dominant plant again, and by far, was the mustard. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. So this is winter. It sat quite nicely and ticked along, but as you all know, brassicas like to grow in cold weather. By August, when it warmed up a little bit, this is probably about 1 foot high, and then by the end of August, it was about 1 metre high, and just starting to run a seed head up. So it was about 95 days, not just on 90 days there when it started to run a seed head up. So probably planted a little bit too early. But at this stage, just a management note that we could do is slash it off, just chop the top of the mustard off. It's like canola, it's like a weed, practically impossible to kill. And that way then it would allow all your understory clovers, etc. to come up. You get a much more even flowering come spring. If you do it sort of 6 weeks out of where your expected avocado flowering, I think you could manipulate your pastures quite well. But that said, you're probably better off just not planting it, use an alternative brassica, because it saves you an extra job going into spring. So this is what it looked like when the avocados were flowering. This is site 2. So this over here is the single run. You see it's just much more compact. It still, has the dominant mustard, of course, but the grower could actually get down the rows and look at their sprinklers and get a motorbike down there and spray some weeds. Whereas where the double run was, it was pretty impossible to get to your trees and look at and get it was pretty impossible to get a vehicle down the rows. But it also, what it started to do, and it sort of alludes to a little bit what Josh and Doug were talking about with the radish, is the mustard was actually going into the trees. And so, it was up probably 2 metres high at most sites. So just bear that in mind. And this is the control rows. This is what most people would normally have. So if you're thinking about plant diversity and insect diversity in spring, this isn't offering a lot. So we looked at the bulk of the pastures and the dry matter per hectare, and by far the one in blue is the trial rows with the mustard, mostly up around the 6.5, 7 tonne per hectare of dry matter. So they were pretty bulky. I think it's the kike in these 2 sites that were making the control rows pretty bulky because they were pretty low looking, and the lucerne didn't have much at all. So during the course of the trial, I took note every time I visited to see what was in flower at the same time. So this is the avocados flowering, what was flowering at the same time as the avocados. Black mustard came in a little bit early, but we're still flowering, but the avocados were flowering. The rye corn a bit later, but that wasn't really dominant anyway, and it's a pollen-producing species. The vetch and the peas led into flowering. And you might think, well, that's not going to do much good, but in fact, that's actually not a bad thing because it's a precursor. It's attracting the insects in, and it's keeping them sustained and there going into your avocado flowering period. Crimson clover aligned perfectly with your avocado flowering, as did your balancer, and then that ticked along. So these is good to have in your mix if you think about you might have a long, prolonged spring and you might still get some more pollination events towards the end of November, December. I don't know if that's how often that happens, but it could happen. And then Persian clover as well, flowering it all through that period. And I also looked at other plants in the orchard. So capeweed in the control rows, that flowered the same time as avocados, and again a little bit before, so it's leading in, attracting insects, sustaining them. Wild radish, of course, there it is, very prolific flower the whole time. And on another site on our farm, we also put a different mix in that had a tillage radish, and that was flowering until the end of November, which is good, but they do have a white flower, so perhaps not as effective for attracting pollinating insects as a yellow flower of a brassica. And then you had your grasses as well. So your insect diversity certainly was there. We didn't measure the eDNA, unfortunately. That would have been a wonderful thing to do. But my trusty research assistant, Wendy, came and put the pans out. So these are the pans, as Josh has explained, they've got soapy water in them. And going into the rows, when you're into the trial rows, you could just tell there was a lot of activity. It was like walking into a crowded shopping centre on Christmas Eve. The noise, the buzz, it was just insane. Whereas you'd go here, it was like the elevator with the do, 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 do. It was nothing, it was radio silence. It was just insane. And you know, there were literally 2 rows over. So the insects were definitely in there. Now this is where I was hoping to use my mouse, and I can't, I'm sorry. So I was hoping to zoom in on this bit, but you probably can't see that. But this is the catch from the traps, and you'll just be able to see the numbers, the frequency of numbers. Control row, not many. Trial row, quite a lot of numbers. This is your insect numbers. Control row, not great deal. Trial row, lots. Control row, not much. Trial row, heaps. So the interesting thing to note, the total numbers in the trial rows of different insects that we caught in the traps, and that's only flying insects, not crawling, 1,723, control row 248. The really interesting thing, your native bee species are up there. There's quite a diverse range of native bees, quite a lot of flies. I'll let the fly man talk about that later. But the really interesting thing was that the bee numbers, the honeybee numbers, in the control rows, 46, in the trial rows, 26. So the honeybees preferred the control rows, where there wasn't much activity, over the trial rows, except for at our place. There was about similar in both. So the flowering we measured as well. I didn't count every individual flower. I counted the stems and multiplied it by a flower factor, because otherwise I would have been there the whole time. And I also counted the flowers on that other little adjacent row at our place on the next block. But as you can see, not a great deal of difference in the flowering, as to be expected. As soon as the flowering was done and the pan traps were done, the growers slashed so that they could get onto their rows. So that's not a bad thing to have done. They were dead keen to get in and spread fertiliser, etc. The only thing you would need to be aware of at slashing too early was that you're going to reduce your seed set for the following year. And at this stage, perhaps also for sandier soil types, you could use what Margaret River growers used in the vineyards and crimp it rather than slash it. So it would just lie it down, chop it off, but leave it there to break down pretty slowly. So here's what you're all wanting to know. Did it improve fruit set? Well, the short answer, not that we can see. So site 1, here's the control, 59.1, treatment 56.4, slightly lower fruit set. Site 2, 142 versus 128 in the treatment, so lower. But the single run was a bit higher. And then at our place was 45, quite a significant drop off down to 32. But here's that little adjacent row sitting on a separate block, 15.4. So that's just lucerne, nothing at all in the insects pollinating stuff. So possible theories, which were all in my notes. I think the traffic, the bee traffic, maybe bees don't like a lot of traffic. Maybe they're solitary workers. But certainly Competing bloom might be a theory, that they're going on the flowers of the pasture species and not on the rows. But the most likely scenario is that there wasn't enough buffer between the control rows and the trial rows to see a significant difference in the flying insects in that block. And that figure there certainly backs that up. But then this also backs up, less traffic. Maybe it's a thing we can do with less stuff. We did do a cost analysis, so Plan Farm did the cost analysis for us. And nothing overly significant in that. Obviously, because it didn't see a yield increase, we didn't see increased costs. But if you can see here where we did see a yield increase is the site 2. The costs, because we didn't see a yield increase in treatment 1 were high, but where you did see a yield increase, there is a cost benefit to sowing the pasture species. We did do soil tests as well last April and this April, but again, didn't see anything significant different, so no trends, but again, there was nothing being depleted, so that's a good thing in terms that the cover crop wasn't taking away from your trees, wasn't robbing anything, wasn't doing anything it shouldn't be doing. But you'd need a more longitudinal study to have a look at that. So basically, if you're going to try this at home, these would be things that I would be considering. Sow a cover crop into well-prepared beds, select a mix that has less small seeds per hectare, scale back your brassica content, or perhaps look at an alternative mix. Select a range of flowering species that provide nectar and avoid your grasses and your cereals. Consider having a year-round food source for your pollinating insects, so plant a variety of species to extend your flowering period as well. Tweak the sowing time for those species that you really want to be flowering when your avocados are flowering, and consider a few different seed blends. I think you need about 6 to 12. Bells have changed their mix this year. I don't think they've taken out the black mustard though. I'd probably avoid the black mustard, but if you have to put it in, you can manage it. There's a Barenberg mix, that was the mix that we had on our farm in another block that we got from FarmLink. That was pretty good, it stayed pretty low, had a good mix of clovers. Goodies Farm will do you a custom mix, or if all else fails and you just want to try something, try a mix of clovers, because they do a pretty good job. And control your canopy if you have to. So there's a few unknowns out of this. It's probably asked us more questions than it answers. The yield data, I don't know, it was a pollination study, so is that important? Perhaps, because at the end of the day, it's what goes in the bin that counts. What its effectiveness in an off year would be, because this year was an on year, it was a good fruit set anyway. So can it lift yield in an off year? Which insects are actually doing the pollinating? I think that's pretty important to know, because from what I read, the honeybees are the best pollinator, and if they're not in your trial rows, then that's pretty bad. But then again, if all the other things are doing a good job and you're attracting lots of other things in, then maybe you are going to get good pollination. Competing bloom, definitely an unknown, but I think maybe Josh's trial will shed some light on that. Too much traffic on the avocado flowers, perhaps, is a thing that maybe needs further investigation on the behaviour of honeybees. And then the longer term benefits to soil health is pretty important to know. Water use efficiency, is it effective at suppressing Phytophthora? We don't know. So the biofumigant properties of brassicas maybe will add an extra benefit, and then perhaps carbon credits as well. So that's it in a nutshell. Thanks. Nothing.
Will you be continuing again this year, the same trial, same place?
The trial has finished, but I think I would certainly continue playing around with it. I probably wouldn't use the black mustard again, but I'd try a mix of different perhaps clovers and a different type of brassica.
Yeah,
Yeah.
off-year will definitely
Yeah,
be more interesting to see.
absolutely.
We did try to get an extension, but they said
Yeah.
Doug. Sorry, please say we'll get corrected.
Howdy, did all those orchards have introduced bees, or did you rely on feral bees?
No, I think Northcliffe did not, but their neighbour has about 50 hives within about 500 metres, or you can see it from the hill, so probably about a kilometre away. We have 5 or 6, but we only had 2 hives near the trial block, and then Site 2 had saturated their place with bees, as they always do. But we wanted them to have their their normal practices. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
One other interesting thing relating to you, Doug, is with your radish theory, at our place, and where I measured the fruit set was basically shoulder height. The brassica was above my head, and once we'd slashed and I stood back and looked at the trees, all of our fruit was in the top of the trees. There was nothing in the bottom half, which is completely conflicting to what Josh's research showed, that the honeybees are in the bottom half of the tree. So it could be temperature.